Welcome to Big Signals from Semaphore Media. I'm Max Tawney, the media editor here at Semaphore, and with me as always is our editor-in-chief, Ben Smith. Hey, Ben.
Hey, Max.
This week on the show, we're joined by the legendary business and marketing executive, Frank Cooper. Frank has been a major figure in American culture and commerce for literally 3 decades and counting. He was a key figure during the kind of beginning of the commercialization of hip-hop, serving as the vice president at Def Jam and Motown Records in the 90s. And since then, he's had a really storied and fascinating career as a marketer at some of the biggest consumer and media brands in America, and is now the CMO at Visa.
I overlapped with Frank at BuzzFeed. He's sort of ridden these really deep currents in American culture for a long time.
Well, we'll ask him about how he's advising Visa on navigating this precarious moment, why hip-hop is as culturally relevant as ever, and how Snoop Dogg became the marketing world's most valuable star. And we're going to do all that right after the break. So, Ben, one of the challenges I feel like of thinking about media in 2025 is that a lot of the time, the people who are moving things are these individuals who are super, super important in their niches, and just nobody else outside of those niches really knows them or has heard of them. I'm describing fragmentation back to you, but this is one of the things that I feel like is both fun as a reporter, because you get to constantly introduce people to new characters who are minorly important, but also kind of vexing. And I feel like this is also something, obviously, that's like kind of defining this moment, not just in media and politics and culture, but also kind of like in the business world, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're right, if you're chasing influence in any space, you're talking about a million creators, a million influencers, and there is just this question of like, what's big? Everything's medium-sized or small. The big stuff is getting smaller.
Right. It really strikes me that there's basically just this kind of increasing gulf between like a very, very small pool of people who everybody knows, and growing and larger pool of people that are extremely important in niche kind of communities, right? Like it's like you've got Taylor Swift and you've got Kendrick, and then you've got just a million people who nobody's ever heard of.
Except their 1,000 true fans who love them.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, one person who's definitely thought about this and who is was kind of the mass culture understander and translator for the executive class for a lot of big brands for a long time, is Frank Cooper, who, Ben, you actually worked with for a little bit.
Yeah, Frank, I love talking to these people who have these kind of long-running, legendary and confusing media careers. Frank got out of Harvard Law School in the early 90s, and as would, be a normal thing to do, went to work for Def Jam, which was then, like a very new, strange, edgy thing to work in hip hop. Also, I think that ran business affairs for Motown at some point before hopping to the internet and AOL. And then, as you say, getting hired by giant companies who needed to understand culture and to make advertising around it. So he worked for PepsiCo. He then did a stint at BuzzFeed, where he was CMO and COO when I was the editor in chief there, and I really loved working with him. Although I always got the sense he found the experience slightly puzzling. Because it was sort of a hint of what you're talking about now. These, someone who was thinking about huge cultural figures and moments like Beyonce versus people who were thinking a lot about memes. And from there, he went back into the corporate world. He's now the CMO of Visa, which makes him, one of the most powerful people in advertising.
Well, we've got Frank on the other line, so why don't we bring him in?
Frank, it's nice to see you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Ben, always good to see you, and I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, and we were talking before you got on here about what sort of like an epic career you've had. You went from Harvard Law to Def Jam. You were at AOL in the kind of bubbly early days. Pepsi. I met you when you were at BuzzFeed, which was a chapter I'm very curious what you thought of.
Yeah.
And now you're one of them. Now you're at the very, very top of the marketing world at Visa. But before we got on, you mentioned you just got off a flight from LA where you were reminiscing about the good old days with LL Cool J.
Yeah.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Well, yeah, I know. If you remember, so LL was the first Def Jam artist, and certainly the first, major Def Jam artist. And he signed up. He was 17 or so. When I came to Def Jam, he was renewing his contract, and he was launching Mr. Smith. But we've been close ever since. And but I asked him, two things. I asked him. I said, one, the first thing I asked was like, what do you think makes a great rapper? And the answer shocked me. Like, because some people have asked me that question before, and I'll go to the technical side. It's it's flow. It's the ability to kind of create images with language. It's also the kind of the rhythmic cadence. It's the ability to pick the underlying track. He said none of those things mattered. Damn. He said only one thing mattered. He says what makes a great rapper is the extent to which they can actually extract from an audience a connection and emotion that makes them feel elevated. That's it, he said. And so some people will fish in a pond and they make people feel elevated. And some people will fish in the ocean and make people feel elevated. And people want to compare success based on that. He says, I don't compare that way. It's like I compare it in terms of they're uncovering something that's already in people and they unlock that. And that to me makes a great rapper. You can't unlock that. You may have a trendy song, you're in and out. You will never sustain a career that way, and people will never remember you, and your music will never become timeless unless you touch something that's already within people and you unlock that. And that for me was profound because it changed my whole view on even this whole Drake Kendrick Lamar battle. Which I was like, oh my God, I've been looking at this the wrong way, and so I've been thinking about that ever since.
Can you talk a little bit about what was it like working in that environment at Def Jam in the 90s? It feels like to me as somebody who kind of I'm a little bit younger, but I've seen all the kind of mythologizing and part of my musical discovery was looking back and kind of experiencing some of that. I mean, what was it like for you being in the room and what was your day-to-day like then?
When you look back on these things, it always looks inevitable to people. It's like, Def Jam or hip hop rose to this level and it became mainstream and it feels inevitable. And I can tell you with 100% certainty, in the 90s, it was not inevitable. Every single day, you have to remember, in New York, you had politicians kind of steamrolling CDs, for hip hop music, saying that this is going to be, the death of youth culture. You had people saying, hey, this is just a fad. It's going to fade out. It's just a thing that's going to pop in and pop out. All that was kind of ruminating. The money had not yet followed the hip hop genre in the 90s. It was just starting to happen. When you got to the mid 90s, it took off. And I think the most critical moment was in the mid 90s. And it was a really fascinating time musically because you had grunge happening up in Seattle and they were steeped in angst. Kind of what was me about the life of suburbia, right? And
I feel really seen here, Frank. Thank you.
That's Ben's story. And then you had hip hop, which is basically saying, how can you overcome struggle? Here are people who are basically saying, hey, we have nothing. Everything's been stripped away, but we're actually going to still figure out a way to move forward and thrive. And if you look at what was happening in the 90s, with the realization I think people started coming to is that the traditional institutions, social institutions that would give you some level of protection were starting to fade. And so people are like, I'm out here on my own. How do I move forward? I feel much more empowered by this thing that they're calling hip hop because they just kind of figure out how to get through it all and to move forward despite all the odds that may be against you. And so I felt like that to me was the most remarkable pivot point. But at the time, we were just hustling. No one knew exactly how it was going to happen, but you start to feel the momentum come. LL had his album, Mr. Smith. Public Enemy had a nice comeback album. We had the Month of the Man with Method Man and Redman. Jay-Z, had the single out with Foxy Brown. And so Jay-Z and Rockefeller Records were starting to rise up. DMX, was starting, you started to feel this momentum, both velocity and scale happening. And he's like, okay, this is something that we always believe is going to last, but this is something that now is going to be a dominant force within culture.
Well, was there a moment in which you felt like, you mentioned that you felt like it was
kind of precarious and nothing was kind of guaranteed. Was there a moment where you thought this might not work?
No, I never felt like that. I felt like, there are moments where like, this is crazy. This is like, like when you walk in any day, anything could happen. We're at 160 Varick Street, which is Soho, but at the time, Varick Street, it's still a little grimy, and they moved from Elizabeth Street to Varick, and that was the upgrade. But you would come into the office. The first thing you see when you come off the elevator was, 3 people elevated behind the kind of the bulletproof glass, and Def Jam really didn't have those issues like Death Row on the West Coast, but still, you also had to feel there was a layer of uncertainty about what would happen in the office any given day, and anything could happen. And so on those days, I'm like, okay, this is crazy. But I never felt like, hey, this is not going to happen. I never felt like, hey, this is not going to break through. Because what I saw, and I think what most of us saw who were there, was that it was much deeper than a song or an artist or even the music itself. If you were in it, you saw the kind of the deep cultural foundation upon which it was built, and the music was feeding, art. The music was feeding events. It was feeding graffiti. Was kind of playing into it at the same time. There was breakdancing happening. It was all kind of this broader cultural movement that was interconnected, and so for us, it felt like it's going to be a massive thing that would continue on and on and on. I'll tell you though, Max, the one thing that I was born in San Francisco and grew up in San Francisco and LA. And so the West Coast is kind of, it's my foundation. The one thing that threw a wrinkle in the whole thing to me was West Coast hip hop. And when West Coast hip hop started to rise up, then the question was, can Def Jam survive through that period of time where sonically things were changing? Because sonically, West Coast hip hop was very, very different. And we did okay. We had Montel Jordan, This Is How We Do It, and Domino came out, and we had Warren G, was regulating Nate Dogg, and we did okay. Yeah.
It's funny. I mean, you talk about it's almost hard to remember now how kind of scary hip hop was to politicians, to businesses. And at some point you sort of became the bridge there yourself. I mean, my guess is that, as these companies turned to hip hop and realized they wanted to be in that, they were looking for, smart, capable business operators totally familiar with that world and found you, or vice versa. But I'm curious, like, how did you, it just seems like such a mind-bending move from Def Jam to PepsiCo, basically.
Yeah, it is. But, and again, this is where I just think I got lucky in terms of timing. And so the one thing I always knew is that every single musical genre, when it first came out, was offensive to the status quo, was dangerous to the status quo. Blues came out, people hated blues. They thought it was the most dangerous thing. They thought it was an offense to gospel music at the time. Jazz came out. They thought that jazz was absolutely like ridiculous in sound. It was sonically a mess, and they thought the lifestyle surrounding it go on and on and on. And so I knew that at some point that hip hop would go mainstream, and but more important is what I said earlier. The thing that I knew that it was serving was a deep cultural need. It's kind of going back to what LL said. The best artists, the best rappers, what they do is find something that is already within people, and it's discovering that or uncovering that and giving it some kind of outlet. I feel like hip hop was going to do that, and when it hit that moment where you could see someone in Scarsdale, New York, respond the same way as someone in Brownsville, New York, then you realize that this is not isolated to one group of people. It is speaking to something that's really deep inside of people. And then I knew we were going to cross the threshold. And so the leap for me was not that hard at that point, because what I believed, and now I think, again, it's become more obvious. I believe that culture and commerce were always interconnected. It's just that the business side, the commerce side, tends to lag way behind in terms of accepting the cultural side of it. It used to be you have to wait till it becomes pop culture, so mass, so mainstream that it's almost meaningless. But as we start to move more and more, into the internet age, into the social age, those that lapse between a cultural movement and it coming into commerce, I think started to converge. And so I felt like it was a great time to do it. And that was my selling point to Pepsi. So for me, I feel like I'm the, I don't know if it's the translator or the connector between those two things.
I'm curious about this moment. You arrived at AOL in 2001, but that company was blowing up, and when the internet was sort of new and things felt really wide open. And I've been thinking that, like, because I was like a young blogger, sort of around that time, and I've been thinking a little bit about how this moment feels a little like that one. Just things are so confusing, so fragmented, so wide open. And I'm curious if you see any, I don't know, what you make of this particular moment in light of all the other places you've been.
The moment in terms of how technology is reshaping.
Yeah.
Yeah, man, when I went into AOL, honestly, I kind of bought into initially that, the revolution is here, and, it's going to happen within AOL, and it's going to supplant, all the kind of historical models that we saw before. I really bought into that. It's like, okay, this is going to happen, and I'm part of that tectonic shift and that change. The lesson I learned very, very quickly is that these entrenched institutions and models typically don't just go away. You might have a company that goes away, but the models don't really go away completely. They evolve. They get included in the change. And so while I'm excited about what's happening right now, and I think it is going to be a dramatic shift. Anyone who's not incorporating AI, for example, it's going to be highly problematic. But I'm less confident that it's going to supplant entire industries. I think you're going to see people adapt in ways that will surprise us. And you'll see some companies, very traditional companies, survive in ways that we think is not, that it's not possible. My whole, Visa, Visa's over 60 years, been in business over 60 years, 1958. And what I think Visa has done fairly well over the years is continue to adapt to the cultural epochs that were happening, science in the 50s and 60s, upward mobility in the 70s and 80s, experiential economy in the 90s. And here we are today.
Yeah, wait, where are we today? What is today?
Yeah, I mean, I know the term I'm using right now, and if you ask me this 2 weeks from now, I may change the term, but I think we're in the era of self-development, where people are now saying, I have to fashion my own self, and I'm looking for things that actually help me feel more alive and help me, give me the ability to move forward in life. So it's that kind of highly individualistic development of self. I think that's where we are. Yeah, they still want experiences. Yes, they still want to have upward mobility. Yeah, they still believe that science is going to help them. But the things that actually make a difference today is like, what are the things? It's a network of people. It could be a brand. It could be, it could be a job that will help me actually advance in life and move forward in life. I think that's where we are.
I mean, one of the things, and I mean, probably both of our businesses that you hear a lot is that we're living in kind of an influencer age. A lot of marketing is devoted to sort of chasing the new influencer. In some sense, you were doing influencer marketing, at a very, very large scale, but, before we called it that, doing deals with celebrities, Beyonce, Eminem, Forrest Whitaker, a Mountain Dew related Forrest Whitaker project that I was reading about. And I'm curious if you see this shift to influencer marketing as different from what you've been doing all along, or as a continuation of it?
I think it's different, Ed, because, there's some things that are the same and some things that are very different. What's the same is that there are individual people who are able to move large groups of people to help shape their perceptions, shift their emotions, shift their behavior. That influence, I think, is still there if you can identify those folks. But what's different is that you can scale up and down on the influence. You can find influencers who have campfire communities, which may seem small, but if you add them all up together, you can get to massive scale. And then you still have a few influencers who actually can speak to large groups and move large groups. Very, very few, though. And in most cases, I'm skeptical of the big celebrity having the ability to shift people's behaviors. even if they have massive followings.
Why? And is that new? Is that different?
I do think it's different. I do think it's different because if you go back in time, I think we have fewer channels and fewer opportunities, and the gatekeepers can make someone a massive star. If you could dominate the radio airwaves, if you could dominate MTV, if you could dominate the live performance venues, your options to look at, like, who do I actually want to celebrate, were fairly limited. And you couldn't necessarily make everybody a star. But when, the term we used to use, we're going to throw the whole building after somebody, we're going to put the whole building behind an artist, the odds are pretty good that that person will have a good shot at being a celebrity with influence for a certain period of time. May not last, but for a certain period of time, because you're going to be flooded with it in a way. And people like, I want to be a part of that. Like, I don't want to be left out of something that looks like it's really happening at scale. Today, no one can actually dominate that. And so now, to me, it comes down to, do you, as an artist, do you have the kind of relationship with your fans that they feel kind of this deep connection to you, a deep loyalty to you, beyond the individual items that you're serving to them? So when I look at Taylor Swift and look at Beyonce, they've done it really, really well. Taylor Swift has probably done it the best in terms of just being able to have that kind of relationship, allowing people to participate, but also giving back, showing up, at places where celebrities would never have done before. And the idea behind it, and Snoop Dogg actually said this to me, which is a long time ago, because I was asking him a long time ago, like, so how did you survive all this craziness, and adapt to all the change, because he also came into the game really, really young, and he just rode through changes and rode through madness, like, real madness. And he said, Frank, a lot of these stars, a lot of these celebrities, they want to get up on the pedestal and they want people to idolize them. He said, I get up on the pedestal and I start pulling everybody up with me. And I want everyone up on the pedestal, elevated with me. And he said, that's all I do over and over and over. And I thought about it, so is that real what he said? And I think it's exactly what Snoop does. And I think that is the logic of a influencer and a celebrity today really having sustainable impact with large audiences, is that you are elevating other people and not really focused on their celebrating you as an individual.
Is Snoop Dogg actually like more famous today than he was even like in the 90s or something like that? Like, to me, I think that something shifted, around the time that he did the Martha Stewart collaboration or something like that. His image has really changed and he's become this big, he was cool for a long time, but he's become this like bankable, marketable star. He's in every commercial. He's introducing the Olympics. He's like a national figure in a way that is somewhat different, it feels like. Do you think that that's true? Does he think that's true?
Oh, I know he thinks it's true. It's like, he was the ultimate gold medalist at the Paris Olympics, and so,
I know.
He was everywhere. He was supposed to go there for 3 days. They kept him there for the entire 2 weeks, paid him a lot of money. And it's funny because Snoop's always had the kind of two sides, right? There's the, number one, in my opinion, he's always been a great human being. Like, if you know him personally, he's like just a kind human being. And those who know him see that. But you have to remember, he did Lee Iacocca. Remember on the golf course back at Chrysler, way back in the day. There's always kind of flirting with the kind of mainstream culture. But I do think, Max, you're right. The Martha Stewart thing was a big shift for him. But even with that, I never would have predicted that.
Yeah, I mean, he's like totally brand safe now, right? Like, I don't know if you've done stuff with him at Visa, but he seems like he's like come a long way in that sense.
That's the shocking thing. I never would have predicted that, honestly. And I worked with him directly, and he's like, hey, cool, you're missing the boat. We've got a lot more to go. You want to come back? I'm like, no, I'm good. I'm good right here. but I never would have predicted that he would be totally brand safe, and he is. And the one thing about Snoop that I think, there's probably two things that play into it. One is, he's one of the most reliable, predictable partners you could ever find, and people may not think that. But you're like, hey, we're going to start here at 10 o'clock. He's going to be there at 9:45. And he'll be there ready to go, and he will deliver exactly what you want to be delivered. And so I think a lot of people underestimate that part of it, but particularly in music, when you can find people like that, is really, really important. Then I think he just mellowed out over the years, as time went on, Snoop started doing things that actually made him feel like he was mainstream. And so, and didn't do the things that historically had marginalized him. And so, again, if I could have predicted it, I would have probably made different plays and different investments along the way, but I could not have predicted it. But he's now fully mainstream, and I'm happy for him. And I honestly believe it could not happen to a better human being. He's a great human being.
Well, we have to take a break, but we'll be back with more from Frank Cooper.
This week on our branded segment from Think with Google, I spoke with Google's VP of Marketing, Josh Spanier, about what marketers are calling the full funnel promise. So the marketing world is famous for its buzzwords, and the new one is apparently full funnel marketing. Do I need to understand what this is?
If you care about marketing, you're going to hear a lot about full funnel marketing. Full funnel marketing is really solving for two problems. The first is that back in the day, brand marketing and performance marketing, so brand marketing, the thing that makes you love a product, and performance marketing, the thing that makes you buy right now, kind of separated. And full funnel marketing is recognizing that separation was somewhat artificial and we need to bring it together. But it's also capturing another thing which has been going on in our industry, which is the non-linear storytelling and journeys that we all go through as we consume different media at different moments, at different times of day, on different screens, all over the place. So full funnel marketing is really all about how do we actually bring marketing together as one coherent strategy, and then how do we actually do so in a way which is true to people's lives and how they actually discover products.
So can you give me an example of a non-linear journey somebody's going through?
Sure, I'll speak to some of the stuff we've done with Google Pixel. So just this first half of 2025, we have had a partnership with the movie Wicked. At the same time, or happening concurrently, we dropped the price for a 3-week price promotion on one of the older models that was going on, that was going to drive people in store. And then we actually had a film in the UK featuring soccer player Sol Campbell, which went viral in the UK. It went so viral it actually reached out into the US. And my job and our job is to, how do we connect all these disparate things that are going on, all these different activities, and then apply measurement across all of them so we know what's the contribution to actual pixel sales. So the non-linear journey there is you went to the movie to see Wicked, you came across an Arsenal sort of meme, and you saw the phone was on sale. You didn't see all those things in sequence, one after the other. You saw them in roundabout ways and they all informed upon each other.
We're all living in extremely confusing situations these days. Where can people find out more about this?
If you head on over to thinkwithgoogle.com, you can find insights on the future of marketing. We recently published a joint study with BCG. It's a great read. Head on over to thinkwithgoogle.com.
Thanks, Josh. One of the things that sort of comes up here, I think, is that it feels like you're still reaching for and sometimes finding these kind of big mass cultural figures at this very fragmented moment. And I don't know if you remember this, but I remember a meeting you had at BuzzFeed where you were suggesting we do something with Beyonce. And I think the sort of like sentiment from the other BuzzFeed executives was like, well, like the internet's bigger than Beyonce. Like who needs Beyonce? And I sort of remember this sort of like slightly puzzled look on your face.
Yeah.
Does that ring a bell?
Oh, no, it rings a bell. It rings a bell because it hurts my heart to this moment because, I'd say, let me put it this way. There are times in which I think brands are so obsessed with making sure that they protect the brand from anyone else kind of taking it over or having greater visibility or momentum that they miss the cultural moment. And there's a moment in which Beyonce was the voice and symbol for a new generation of women. And if you recognize that piece of it, you could leverage that in a way that allows her to remain true to herself, but also to connect it to a brand. And if the fear is like, well, what if Beyonce becomes bigger than the brand? My view on it is like, so be it, because you can't stop the momentum that happens in culture. You can only like ride it and hopefully, participate in it and hopefully get back to it, but you're not going to stop it from happening. And so you can watch it go by. And I feel like we watched that one go by.
Yeah, that's on my list. That's on my list of mistakes we made.
So Frank, you were mentioning before that there's kind of this limited pool of folks who can really move the needle celebrity wise. At Visa, you guys did a concert series at the Louvre with Post Malone. I'm kind of curious. Is he one of those kind of figures? And also, like, is your job more complicated now? Do you have to kind of keep track in your mind of, dozens and dozens of kind of micro influencer type of people? Tease that out a little bit for me.
Yeah. So the concert, these are live at the Louvre.
Yeah.
So we did it with Post Malone. We also had Ira Starr, Afrobeats artist. And the idea of it was not so much about, is Post Malone the influencer or is Ira Starr the rising star? Is more about, can we do something around music that is interesting, engaging, and fulfilling to the artist, but also to a fan base. So we're looking at, what's happening in music right now? Big festivals were still happening. Everyone wants to do a stadium tour, but the intimate place is what's differentiated and special. And so when I looked at something like, say, NPR Tiny Desk, they're like, well, why do we all love that Tiny Desk thing? It's because it's so different from what we're seeing in terms of the super polished, highly choreographed. It's just you, the talent, sitting right behind there, a mic dropped from the ceiling, and you're delivering or you don't deliver. And so, can we create other environments that are unique experiences like that, and that the artists would appreciate, the fans would appreciate? So the Louvre, which never had a live concert like that before, we felt like that would be one of those places. The way I think about it is, rather than have total dependency on one artist and kind of rolling the dice on whether that artist has that influence or not, or looking at the data and saying, I think the data supports it, I'd rather build the platforms that allow multiple artists to come on there. But we're still looking at influencers. And for me, the way I've changed my view on this over time, I used to look at the data and say, like, who has influence, and then let's look below the data and see who's getting really engaged, a really engaged audience. Then let's see kind of who can actually move people down the chain and maybe even get them to actually buy something. And I still do that to a certain extent. But the big shift for me is, like, it's not so much about the influencer first. It's about Visa first. It's about us first. Like, do we know who we are? Like, do we know, like, the audiences that we're trying to get? If you're thinking about it in the traditional media way, which drives me crazy, by the way, because traditional media would say, buy an 18 to 34-year-old audience, still to this day drives me crazy. I'm like, I have no idea who's an 18 to 34-year-old audience. I don't know what that is. I do know, that if you can identify a cultural group that's important to you, that I can move that, and I can think about the symbols and the rituals and the kind of the evangelists and the stories and the history that make up that group. And then that I can tap into, and I can figure out who are the influencers within that group, as opposed to these kind of fake proxies that kind of prance around as, scientific groupings of people.
We talked to some of your peers, and there's definitely a sense that, like, some influencer will blow up on a Tuesday, and there's like a scramble among companies over the next 3 days to be like, how do we get on her feed? What do we pay her to promote our product? Do you think that's a mistake?
I think it's a huge mistake. It's a standard reflex reaction that you see a lot of large companies and large marketers pursue, which is, what's hot? Let's fast follow and see if we can get that and compete against it. And I'm not saying I won't ever do that. So if you see me do it, don't send me a note like, Frank, I thought you'd never do that. But I'd rather know who we are, and I'll take someone who has a smaller audience, but everyone would say, like, yeah, that makes sense. What they're doing over there, that particular influencer, will want to work with Visa because they have shared values, a shared vision of the how to move an audience. And they're helping each other kind of move forward. I'd rather have that.
And I think, one of the things that's been always interesting to watch you is you do sort of think of these sort of deep cultural currents and follow them. And it does, in this particular moment in American culture, is so divided, so politically divided. Do you market differently to Red America, to Blue America? Do you find common ground? Do you look for channels within those things? How do you navigate that incredibly dicey moment as a marketer?
Yeah, we could spend an hour on that piece, because this is I think it's one of the most precarious moments, and I don't think this is like a shock, the most precarious moments in history for the United States in particular. in terms of the body politic and how, we find some kind of commonality across all, the geographies of the United States. I think it's there, by the way. I just think that we're in that moment where it's hard to see it. Fortunately for me, I don't have to dip into that. And so I find the things that transcend these divisions. And so someone would say like, hey, country music, Frank, is a red state thing. Is it? Yeah, I'm not sure. Shabuzi and, Beyonce and others kind of have shifted that, but even more than that, even if you take a deep country, Luke Combs, a deeply embedded country artist, they're now starting to change people's perception of what that music is. I think it's one of the most dynamic music genres out there today. And I can tap into that in ways that don't even begin to kind of force us to confront the political divisions that happen in the world. If I'm in video gaming and if you're a video game creator or if you're just a hardcore video gamer, you're not really doing a whole lot of talking about like who did you vote for the local city council. You're going to be in that world, and there are things that we can do in that world that add value. And so I'd rather play in that space. So to me, it's a little bit of a beacon of light that there are things that bind us all together. When we get beyond this kind of massive division that's happening in politics, it's a reminder that there are things that bind us together. And I just try to find those things as much as possible and stay away from anything that actually, speaks to the deep divisions that are happening in the political landscape.
What are they? What are the things that you think that are kind of uniting for people that you see?
Well, fundamentally, everybody wants to figure out how do I have the opportunity to move forward in this crazy world that we're living in now, where nothing seems as certain as it used to be. Everyone's trying to figure that out. So if you speak on that level, that foundational level, I think you have a good chance of winning. When you get into these passionate spaces and lifestyle spaces, including sports, they both divide and gather. But you'll find groupings that are not based on kind of political leanings. And so whether that's American football or whether that's global football, soccer, and when I first came in on a visa, I was like, wow, we got a lot of investments in these sports. I'm like, are you guys sure? And then, but then you start to see the fan base connected to it. You start to realize that in live sports, there's no more engaging activity. The one thing that tends to work on linear TV still is live sports. And it's this kind of communal affair that happens in connection with it. But the Olympics aside, the Olympics is another thing which has a lot more complications to it. But when you look at soccer, you look at the NFL, I see community gathering around, and they're based on teams, cities, players. And that to me is another form of gathering and transcending these kind of political divisions.
All right. Well, on that, we can end on a surprisingly optimistic note. So thank you so much for taking the time, Frank. It's great to see you.
That bit, Max, I appreciate it. It was a lot of fun. Let's do it again.
So, Max, I've known Frank a long time, so I'll let you kick this off. Like, what did you learn from that conversation?
I am so happy. This is actually one of our first full circle kind of moments on the podcast, which is, I believe we talked about Snoop Dogg with one of the other previous marketers. And I think I expressed my theory that something that at some moment he went from a musical icon to a true commercial marketable kind of icon. And I think that, and Frank confirmed it, and confirmed that he knows it, and confirmed that it really started with the Martha Stewart collaboration that kind of like actually legitimately changed his perception, and also kind of opened up all of these opportunities for big brands and marketers to kind of capitalize on his charisma.
His charisma, and also, I mean, like the eternal lessons show up at 9:45 for the 10 a.m. shoot.
That is true. Yes, being a person who's easy to work with. Also, I did think that it's very interesting to me how plugged in he really still is to the kind of cultural part. I assumed that at some point you do, as an executive, move beyond. You outsource your cultural knowledge to other people, but it is clear to me that, at least, that from talking to both him and Leslie Berland, who is the CMO of Verizon. We talked to her earlier this season. It's clear to me that a big part of their jobs is literally just grinding through, churning through culture and trying to understand what the people who are connecting with large groups, the artists and the musicians and the creators who are connecting with large groups of people, and why.
But honestly, from them, two really different philosophies of how you go after it. Like, and I sort of referred to, I didn't mention Leslie earlier, but I think she's very much of the, like, you got to stay totally on top of TikTok, know what's happening in the moment, and dive in really opportunistically. And Frank, and this was my experience of him at BuzzFeed, it was a real, in some sense, a kind of a culture clash there. So he said it hurt his heart, but he's really thinking, like, there are these kind of like deep currents and huge figures, and that, like, the value you get out of a collaboration with Beyonce, which might be incredibly complicated and expensive to execute, might take an enormous amount of time, that's where most of the value is. These, like, very, very carefully staged, thoughtful things at the Louvre. Like, you're doing these sort of big, slow projects in a way, as opposed to in a moment when I think a lot of the culture is chasing things that are happening and changing very, very, very fast. And those are two kind of different ways, I think, of looking at media.
It's true. And of course, I think Frank had a little bit more of a laid back view of, what can these people do for us versus, how do we kind of tap into some of their success? I think that it's very interesting that he basically has flipped it and thought, okay, who of these individuals align with our values? Not, can we align ourselves with kind of some of these individuals? Not that was something that Leslie was saying necessarily.
Yeah, we can have them both on to debate it later.
Yeah, no. I think she actually was saying the same thing in different ways as well. She felt like, she felt like that there was kind of an alignment, and so she had to capitalize on it.
Yeah.
The other thing that I thought was kind of interesting, and this is a kind of another recurring theme in all of our conversations, is just how important sports are to propping up the media industry, and also kind of like continuing to serve as the one through line that is binding our kind of Americans and even people in the world kind of together. Frank mentioned the Olympics, but also football, being a huge kind of part of that. And it just occurs to me, hearing from Frank and thinking about some of the other folks that we've talked to this season, how much sports are both one of the only remaining unifying kind of cultural forces in the country, and also one of the only things that seem to be a kind of a place where businesses feel safe operating and feel like they can kind of make a lot of money.
Oh, for sure. And a big part of Frank's job is, and you sort of heard him say that, is like frantically scanning the horizon for safe places to put money. And parts of the music industry are that, and then you start looking elsewhere, and sports is just absolutely the top of it. And I think that's where you see these huge investments in all sorts of now live streaming on places like Amazon and Netflix that never did it before. It's the last thing anybody's watching on television. And I do think interest has been relatively resistant to politicization, right? Like, I think there was around Black Lives Matter, there was a sort of ripple of like, oh, our sort of more conservative sports fans going to be alienated from the NFL, and that is like truly a thing that did not happen.
Yeah, and what's clear too is just that the majority fans truly hate it. They don't like they don't like sports being politicized at all, and they recoil at that.
No, and that's why, like, just any politician who goes to attempts to throw out the first pitch at a Yankees game will get booed. Like, it doesn't matter who. Maybe actually, I think George W. Bush right after 9/11 didn't get booed, and then I remember when in the Obama administration they were going to have Michelle throw out the first pitch, and it was just like, she's obviously going to get booed because they just boo everyone. Like, no one wants a politician out there. And one of the sort of cleverest tricks I've ever seen was they had an aging Yogi Berra escort Michelle Obama to the mound. because like nobody's going to boo Yogi Berra.
That is totally
That's
brilliant.
a sort of heat shield for politics.
That's it for us this week. Thank you for listening to Mixed Signals from Semaphore Media. Our show is produced by Sheena Ozaki with special thanks to Max Toomey, Britta Galanis, Chad Lewis, Rachel Oppenheim, Anna Pizzino, Garrett Wiley, Jules Zern, and Tori Kaur. Our engineer is Rick Kwan, and our theme music is by Billy Libby. Our public editor this week is Snoop Dogg. He's bankable, he's marketable. People want to know what he thinks about things and brands, and they'll buy his stuff.
Yes. So please tell us what you think about this podcast, Snoop Dogg, if you're listening. And even if you're not Snoop Dogg, but you like Mixed Signals, please follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and feel free to review us.
And if you still want more, you can always sign up for Semaphore's media newsletter, out every Sunday night.